How defined do you want your protagonist to be in your RPG game? You can go anywhere from you are a complete blank slate, a tabula rasa, up to you are playing such a defined character that it's hard to define you as an RPG any longer. It's a pretty finely divided spectrum, and each stop along the way offers slightly different advantages and disadvantages. On the extremely open end, you have the tabula rasa, where your character is not defined at all, where the game imposes no limitations upon what you are, what you do, the story that is told around your character. I can't think of any AAA RPG that is a true tabula rasa game. Even games like BG3 or Skyrim put some constraint, put some structure around your player. You are the Dragonborn. You have a brainworm and have to do something about it. True unstructured tabula rasa is really a game that's going to have to live and die around its systems. It lends itself very strongly to an open world. It lends itself to stories that wait for you to show up. If the world is effectively in a static state, then you, as this blank character, can come into a dungeon or into an experience, interact with that one experience, define your character within that context, and then move on to another one that is unaffected by what you've done in the other situation. This is Campfires in the Dark. This is the game reacts to you in the moment that you act, but your lasting impression upon the world is relatively small, because in order to allow you to do whatever you want, be whatever you want, the storytelling needs to be relatively thin, the interconnectivity needs to be minimal to allow for this much interaction, this much freedom. A tabula rasa style protagonist also very much points towards a silent protagonist. If you're going to let me do or say effectively anything, then you need lots and lots of player dialogue. Even if ultimately the reaction behind the scenes is minimal, for me to feel like I have the ability to do whatever I want, you need to give me a lot of choices when I'm talking to someone. To voice all of that is very impractical. As we move to a slightly more defined character, now we start to see some AAA games. This is where Skyrim and BG3 live, where you are pretty blank slate, but you have some definition. Maybe that definition is told to you in Chargen, or maybe it is something that is applied to you during the prologue. Maybe you make a blank slate character, but then immediately have a brainworm shoved in your head, thus restricting your freedom to some degree. This is still good for the kind of story that is largely waiting for you to show up. In Skyrim, the game allows you to define yourself based upon the different things you might become. Maybe you become head of the bard colleges. Maybe you become archmage. Maybe you do both of these things. Because everything is still on the table, the game has some difficulty reacting to things you do in other places. It might be hyper reactive in the moment when you are in the situation, but often the rest of the game, the rest of the world, is largely unaware of the things that you are doing. Implemented well, this can lead to a very, very robust, system-driven kind of storytelling. The reason why you can watch Matt Mercer climb into a keep by piling up a bunch of boxes and the entire game doesn't eat itself is because BG3 has a very robustly implemented Campfires in the Dark style of scripting. The game doesn't really care how you got into the keep. All it cares about is that you did. But you can sort of see that there's negative side to that as well, because if it doesn't really care how you got into there, it can't really react to how you got into there either. As we get a little bit more defined, you get into something like Dragon Age Origins, where you have a background, you have a last name, you are still more defined. You are one of a character from a rosters of characters. You still have a lot of freedom in terms of what you do. You still probably want to have a silent protagonist here because we're still giving you immense amount of branching possibilities in terms of what you say in your conversations with other people. But your character is becoming more defined. You might be a human noble. You might be a mage who grew up in a mage college. We start to have the ability to have more storytelling opportunities because we know where you grew up. We know who your childhood friends are, potentially. And as a result, this gives us opportunities to introduce more storytelling vectors. The pure Tabula Rasa is kind of what old school D&D used to look like. I made my character largely without regard to the world that I was going to play in. We all show up in a tavern and form a party for some relatively strange reason, and then we go off and the world now reacts to our presence. But what I've found as I've dungeon mastered over the years is I've tended to move towards slightly more defined situations, whether it be by putting some constraints on the characters in terms of what they can build. You all have to be going to a magical college, or you all have to be elves, or you all have to be from this one town, or by integrating the characters' backstories in such a way that effectively they become a more defined character retroactively. I mutate the universe around their backstory as if I intended that all along. That's something you can really only do in a tabletop RPG where you're able to throw away large swaths of world building to mutate around the character. But as I have matured as a dungeon master, as I think the genre has matured in general, I think we've actually seen these pure blank slate, be whatever you want, be a 75-year-old war veteran, be a 3-year-old magical prodigy in the same party, has largely gone away. And there's been more movement towards anchoring the storytelling a little bit, putting constraints on the player a little bit to improve the cohesiveness of the world building, of the storytelling. As we restrict you further, you enter into a situation like the Mass Effects, where you are a defined character. You are Shepard, you are a Spectre. There is quite a lot of definition within what you are. This is the first place where it's really very practical to start having a voiced protagonist, because now we've restricted the possibility space for the protagonist sufficiently that it becomes possible to still give the player a bunch of different choices, but also that list isn't so broad that you can't characterize it within the context of what the character is. In the Mass Effect trilogy, you are Shepard, you are a Spectre, you are a man of action. There are gradations of that. There is Paragon and Renegade, but you aren't a pacifist. There are actions, there are dialogue choices that are off the table. When we become even more defined, we become a very specific character. This is The Witcher, this is Dragon Age 2, where you are Geralt or you are Hawke. You have some freedom in terms of the way your character reacts to different situations, in terms of tone and in terms of how you perceive what's going on. But if you are a Witcher, you are going to behave in a specific way. And you aren't just a Witcher, you are specifically Geralt. So your breadth of reaction is limited. You have freedom to choose, but again, it is more tightly controlled. This gives writing a lot of freedom in terms of allowing very deep, tight storytelling, because you know that Geralt or Hawke is going to react within this relatively narrow subset. It opens up the possibility space in terms of how deep you want these interactions to be. When we become even more defined than that, we're kind of popping out the other side of RPG, and we are getting into something like Uncharted, where your character is so defined that there is effectively no choices. this does still offer some benefits. Because you are so incredibly defined in terms of your actions, in terms of how you interact with the world, you are effectively able to write the protagonist like a movie character, because they only react with the situation in one specific way. You're not giving up any pacing to dialogue options. You are able to react and have a very immersive cinematic experience. But of course, as we've moved down this spectrum, the amount of player agency has continued to go down. And here, in the storytelling, we effectively have none. We can determine how we shoot our gun, but our ability to control the storytelling is largely gone completely. Those 6 different stopping points are really the ones that define what I would say you could argue your way into saying this is an RPG. Anything from I am virtually undefined and the world is there for me to poke at, up to I am so defined that I am controlling someone else's character within a world. But there are some other styles of who the protagonist is that I think are worth discussing in this conversation. So some non-RPGs basically define the protagonist as being you. This is really advantageous in certain situations if you can get away with it. It's very easy to pick up. You're not asking the player to do any mental gymnastics whatsoever. If you're playing one of the Wii exercise games, or you are playing Tetris, or you're playing a game like Balatro, you're you. You're just you playing Tetris, or you playing Balatro. It's not asking you to do any lifting around suspension of disbelief whatsoever. This requires zero setup, but it's pretty hard to anchor a story on this. You can sort of maybe imagine a first-person game in a style like BioShock, where you are kind of moving through a world and experiencing mostly a story that's already over, maybe trying to do this kind of characterization, trying to imply that it's just you moving through the space. You feel this a little bit in some of the walking simulators, like Gone Home. Now, Gone Home isn't actually this kind of protagonist. You are an actual character because you have a sister and you are a woman based upon the way the storytelling is done. But you do at times when playing a game like that feel like it's you moving through the space. So there might be some interesting room here for exploration in the RPG space around leaning into your character being less defined, almost non-existent, and pushing some of that characterization onto the actual player. Not really sure what that would look like, but it's an interesting thought experiment. Now, one of the problems with this it's me style of protagonist is for some people, with some games, it can actually become confusing. I've had this conversation with more than one person about games like Magic the Gathering or different strategy games where they want to know, who are they? The difference between something like Magic the Gathering and something like Tetris is in Magic, you have an existence inside the fiction of the game because you have health points and you are being attacked. So who are you? You're not you because you're magically summoning things. I don't personally really have this confusion, so it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about this particular problem, but something to be aware of if you have no protagonist character is that if it isn't incredibly simple, some of your players might get confused, and with that confusion, they might nope out of your game because they don't really understand who they are and what they're doing. And you see that a lot of games where you might expect that the answer would be you're playing you actually put just enough characterization in place to try to dodge this. In Hearthstone, you don't play you have a character for the deck that you're building. Each of your decks has a different character who has emotes and actually has a backstory. But it's just enough for you to be like, oh, I'm not me, I'm playing this mage character. okay, I got it. So something to keep in mind if you are making a game that isn't an RPG is under some circumstances you might need to provide some characterization to a protagonist in order to give something for some of your players to hang their hat on, to understand what's going on. As I said, this isn't a confusion that I really am susceptible to, so it's a little hard for me to understand where the boundaries of this are, but it's something to keep in mind. The astute among you might notice that there are actually two vectors at play here. There is how much is defined in the creation of your character, and then also how much freedom you have in making character-defining choices throughout gameplay. And you can have games that exercise either of these, neither of these, both of these things. You could certainly very easily make a game that offers an immense amount of freedom in character creation and then basically never allows you to do anything interesting with that character, where you're just moving through an essentially static story with a character that could be a demon with wings or a fairy or a banana. And it doesn't matter because the game doesn't really care what you are. And on the other extreme, you could have a game that gives you a fully predefined character and doesn't give you any flexibility in character creation whatsoever, but then allows you to make a lot of character defining choices around how you interact with situations and the way you talk to players, setting your tone, but also setting forth very moral, very strong character defining decisions along the way. So I've simplified two axes into one to simplify this conversation. And to some degree, these two vectors are somewhat in opposition. The more breadth I have in character creation, the harder it is to build a story that's able to give me a lot of room to make choices within the story. If I can be a banana or I can be a Balrog in the same game, it's hard to make the world be able to care about that much breadth. Whereas if I am always Commander Shepard, the Spectre, then I'm able to more easily build a playground in which you are able to make meaningful choices about the way that things go, because we have less play space to play with. Now, with effort, you can overcome this opposition. It's not really that they're in opposition, they just sort of define this space that you are required to fill in. And one way to control the size of that space is by limiting one or both of those vectors. If you provide me with an immense amount of freedom on both, then that play space, that possibility space, becomes immense as well. Which is the best? Well, of course, it depends on what you're trying to do. The more you lean towards the tabula rasa, the more freedom you're going to be required to give the player. Because if I'm less defined, I'm expecting to be able to have more control over what's going on. But it's also going to be easier for you to do that. You can move to a silent protagonist. You can provide a lot more options. You can move towards storytelling that is very campfires in the dark, is waiting for the player to come along, and give the player tons and tons of choices to really allow them to define the character for themselves. When you're leaning into tabula rasa, a lot of the characterization, a lot of the storytelling lives inside the player's mind because they put together the stories themselves. This is one of the great powers of Campfires in the Dark, is the player will fill in a lot of the blanks, which means you don't have to provide that. You actually get storytelling for free to some degree because the player will take the pieces that you give them. This is a 600-piece jigsaw puzzle, but you're only giving them 150, 200 pieces, and their mind is filling in the rest to make the picture that they want to see. And there is a great power in that. But if you want to tell a more cinematic story, if you want everything to knit itself together into an overarching narrative, if you want deep characterization that evolves over time, then you're going to want to start to restrict the player a little bit more, to define them a little bit more, to provide more boundaries around what the character can be, can do, is within the world. We have Game of the Year games all the way along this spectrum that are able to tell great stories in their own way while providing virtually blank characters up to incredibly defined, very restricted characters. When you're approaching this, you need to think about what your goals are. For me, probably because of my programming background, I love the idea of these intricate systems and the gears interacting, which is what you get in the more blank slate style of games. But as a player, I do personally actually like a little bit more characterization around my protagonist, a little bit more of a box to play in, so I understand who I am and the goals that I'm playing within the game. I find that I actually immerse myself more deeply into the story. When I'm playing a game like Skyrim, I can lose the narrative thread. It's not that I don't enjoy a game like Skyrim, but it becomes more of an activity as opposed to a narrative experience. So when I'm looking for narrative, I like a more defined character. When I'm looking for systems, when I'm looking for activity, then a more blank slate character can be the way to go. These can all work for you. Pick the one that fits your goals the best. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. As well, we have a Patreon now. There will be a link to that as well if you are more comfortable with that. We have merch. This is Control the Triage, Control the Project. If you're interested in picking something up, there will be a tag to the store in the video as well. Do you have a preference for how defined your protagonist is? What do you wish more games were doing? One of the promises of AI that might be further away than people might think would be to auto-generate VO or have the game react to the player, potentially opening up more storytelling in a Tabula Rasa style game. Like I said, I think we're further away from that than people might believe. Would you be interested in a game like that? Would you be interested in a game that reacted to you and restructured itself as you were playing? Even if the storytelling maybe wasn't up to snuff because it was just auto-generated AI stuff. Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.